Our goals for the session are to kind of give a landscape, and that's both for insight about what the U.S. Department of Education has offered in terms of flexibility. We saw that a little bit earlier from Secretary Cardona when he spoke, as well as from Bobby Scott. Then we want to really unpack the implications of this and what are the opportunities and potential challenges around the data that we're using to get a picture and a story of how the pandemic is impacting our students and where are our areas of opportunity to not only look at the short-term crisis and really meeting their needs in the short term, but also look at longer term. One of my favorite things about working for state boards of education is we don't necessarily always have blinders on and look at the immediate crisis. We really do, state boards do a great job of thinking, what's that long-term vision for education? What's that state strategic plan? And how can we broaden our focus out to look at the implications not only for this spring, but next fall and the falls that follow. So I'm going to try to jump right in. I'm going to introduce Mary Ann, and then give a couple brief remarks. I am absolutely delighted that we have Mary Ann Snider to help us through this conversation. Mary Ann comes to us as the former deputy superintendent from Rhode Island. She has a great depth of technical knowledge, but one of the things I love about how Mary Ann explains technical concepts, explores and analyzes data, she always does it from the perspective of the student experience. What is it telling us about the student? And what is it telling us about the ways that we can modify our instruction or help that experience for students from the actions that are taken by the folks around the students in terms of administrators, teachers, and other folks who can help. Before I turn it over to Mary Ann, I'm just going to lay out some broad questions that I want you to thinking about too as we talk about data. The first is to kind of think in the back of your mind when we engage in conversations about data, what's the purpose of that information? That's a really important question from a fundamental concept about using data, and that's around validity. We really need to know what the intended purpose is of to make sure that we're using the evidence and the data supports that intended purpose. So clarifying and asking, why are we collecting this data? For what purpose and to what end is a great question for state boards to be asking. Also thinking about, is that measure fair and accessible? Think about the perspective of students with disabilities, English language learners, culturally diverse perspectives. Always have that in the back of your mind, thinking about the data and information and how you're using it. Is it fair and is it accessible? Also, always think about who is using this information and for what actions. Ideally, data tells a story that catalyzes actions. And it's not the data itself that really is powerful, it's the actions taken by teachers and administrators for the betterment of students that really makes impactful information about using data to improve student learning. And finally, what resources and capacity building empower those actions? Do folks have what they need to take the actions based upon the story the data is telling? And I think that's the crux of the conversation that we're having during the pandemic. We're looking at untangling the idea of using data and data around student learning for purposes of accountability, which in most people's minds was around school sanctions and classifications. But what we really want to use data for during this pandemic is to understand the student experience and make sure we're getting the resources to those folks who need it so we can address learning recovery as quickly as possible. And it's within that frame of reference that the U.S. Department of Education offered some guidance to. And it helps firm on the perspective that we need to administer state summative assessments to have that picture of student learning. For example, Bobby Scott talked about how important it is to manage things. We need to be able to measure them. And looking at that scope of learning recovery that needs to happen, the department offered some options for states that do not require a waiver. Things like remote administration of the assessment, if that's something your state is able to do, shortening test forms to look at that balance between time spent on instruction and time spent on assessment to maximize the extent possible that time spent on instruction. Extending the testing window was also an option from the department. And that provides the kind of nice sync with the American Rescue Plan and things that we've heard earlier in the conference. Folks are extending the testing window as rates of positivity for COVID go up and down to maximize the participation for students in that assessment so we have data on their student learning. But as states start to think about rolling forward into the summer to provide summer learning opportunities, we also have a potential to extend that testing window over to the summer and even into the fall. And I'm sure Marianne will get into that too in her remarks. The department also did have a line in the letter that we've talked about and I want to make sure we fully address. that it recognized that there may be some unique circumstances for states where there might need to be additional flexibilities offered. And we did have about 10 states that rolled forward and submitted a waiver request. So the options I talked about before did not require a waiver, but we have 10 states that are asking for a waiver. And it falls into about 3 different buckets. So these are very high level buckets. The first is states that are requesting a full waiver of all summative assessments, similar to what we saw in March last year. From my perspective, I think this is the steepest hill to climb to get to a yes at the US Department of Education. We also have a couple of states that are looking at substituting in district interim assessments in lieu of that state summative assessments under a different variety of circumstances, whether or not it's schools that are in a remote only environment and they're looking at a district interim assessment that could be offered in a remote environment if that state summative could not be, or allowing districts the flexibility. And we also have one state that is creating a sampling plan, which means a small number of students would actually participate in the assessment, but it would provide an opportunity to create estimations for how student learning is at the state level and at the district level. The department also provided accountability guidance and waivers too. And this is about using that information. What's the purpose, who's using it, and towards what end? And the use of the assessment is where the department offered flexibility, because we all know that the environment in which assessments are offered this school year is very different than a typical school year. Assessments, especially standardized assessments, are typically standardized in format to have the same expectations for kids, and to the extent possible, the same experience for kids. And we know that during the pandemic, that schooling experience has been very different. So how we use the data also should shift and change. And the department looked at offering states waivers around school classifications, participation rate. ESSA requires a 95% participation rate for all students to participate in the assessment. And the department acknowledged that there needed to be some flexibility therein. And report cards is also a huge opportunity too, both from states' perspective of how to frame this data, but also a simple perspective from the department is that if you're not classifying schools, you don't actually have to include that classification on your report card. But in return for offering that guidance and flexibility and waivers around accountability or the use of assessment, the department is asking states to help tell the story about the pandemic that perhaps has not been told before. And that's to make sure that we're adding information around chronic absenteeism, the number of students who are not engaged in their educational experience, disaggregated by different subgroups. Technology access is also a request from the department in exchange for the flexibility around accountability. And looking at students or teachers' access to devices and high-speed internet, again, disaggregate it so we can start peeling back that onion. But there's huge opportunity, I think, beyond even federal decisions around the use of data during the pandemic to state decisions. The Every Student Succeeds Act requires assessments in reading, mathematics, and science, but states have additional sometimes requirements around assessments and different measures that are used for their own purposes. Social studies, writing assessments, civics assessments. We've seen states take different actions therein on their state assessments. State accountability too is much broader than actual federal accountability. Many states have rules around student promotion, teacher evaluation, high school graduation requirements that are linked to assessments or other measures too. This as an opportunity for states to explore flexibility and options that actually don't require you to negotiate out with the feds too. It also may require you to negotiate out with your state legislatures too, which I'm sure we'll hear about a little bit. There's, like I said before, an opportunity around framing the data from the way the state shares that information with parents and the public on your state report cards. Are we telling the story of a student's context during the pandemic? So what does this all mean? I was going to go very fast through this. We've talked about the guidance. We've had some questions too, but I want to put this in the context of what we've been hearing at the conference too. How Chairman Stott talked about you cannot manage what you do not measure. He also alluded to not only the moral implications of the need for speeding around learning recovery, but the economic implications too. We've started to see a number of studies that looked at the impact upon GDP of the interrupted instruction for our students during the pandemic. We've also seen a potential impact upon their lifetime earnings based upon missed instructional opportunities. Even more interesting too, I think we're starting to peel back the onion more on learning recovery. Differences in subjects between mathematics and reading. where the situation in mathematics might actually be a little bit more grave than in reading, and differences at grade levels between early learning grade levels and high school. We also heard during a Voices session that education right now is fragile from a student's perspective and from a teacher's perspective. And the Secretary of Education challenged us that we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to rethink and reset our education system. So what does that mean for the way that we're measuring things, our purposes, and our actions that we're taking, and the capacity that we're offering our districts and administrators to make changes? And then we just heard at 1 p.m. today too, some themes too about how states will operationalize assessments, the kind of balance between a willingness to make the best of this, but acknowledging things aren't going to be perfect, and thinking back to our earlier questions about how that changes our purposes and our uses of the data. So with that, I told you I was going to steamroll through this. I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ann and stop sharing my screen.
All righty. Thank you, Abby. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for that comprehensive overview, Abby, that really sets the stage for what I hope will be a conversation among us. So as Abby said, I'm Mary Ann Snider. I was a deputy commissioner in Rhode Island. And before that served as the chief of teaching and learning. I was the assessment director for a while, handled accountability. And when Abby asked me to do this, even though I've stepped down from my state role, I was so honored and happy to join you, because I know what an incredibly pivotal role you play within your states. And I know that I fully appreciated and look to our state board in Rhode Island to kind of to help us be the broker between many different perspectives, and to be the moral compass and bring rational, reasoned thought to complicated decisions as you set policy and helped state chiefs kind of plan a path forward. So I deeply, deeply appreciate the work that you do. And I was telling Abby when we were kind of waiting to get started together that I stepped down from my role as deputy commissioner about 1.5 years ago and thought I might become a lady who lunches. That was my goal. And that lasted for a good week or two. And now I'm doing a little bit of consulting, but my joy is serving as an academic dean at an all-girls academy in Rhode Island. So from PK to grade 12. And wrote their COVID reopening plan for them, and have been working in the school tirelessly, managing and observing and walking through what this year has been with parents and teachers and students in particular. And it's just been an amazing year. And I'm sure each of you has a similar story to tell, kind of observing all that is trying to be education under COVID. And so here we are at this moment where we're trying to figure out how do we, while I think we're in a moment where things feel a bit more optimistic, and we're using words like recovery planning a little bit more frequently. But we need information to do that, right? And I think it sounds like throughout this conference, lots of people have been talking about that and saying we need good information. So I couldn't agree more. You're not going to hear something different from me, but how we get to that point, given your very different state circumstances, not to mention the range of possibilities that have been playing out within districts within your state, city to community, have just been enormous. You know, I've witnessed it in our own little state of Rhode Island, and I can't imagine what it's like in Illinois, for instance. So I know that we bring that to the table as well. Last fall, like in September, Ed Council reached out to me and another woman, Lisa Dare, and asked us to think about putting a toolkit together to guide states and thinking through how they might approach state assessments and accountability this year. And last fall, things looked a lot bleaker than they do right now. And we were imagining everyone being fully remote all year. And I know that's changing quickly as we all get vaccinated and positivity rates go down and all of that. But I think the toolkit is helpful to talk about some of the policy issues and the technical issues that I'm sure you are all thinking about as you're having these conversations within your district. So I'm going to lay out a few things, but I do best when engaged in a conversation. Even when I was a teacher, I was not the sage on the stage ever. So please, like, you're not interrupting, you're engaging. You know, we can unmute you and we can have that conversation, please. So when Lisa and I started imagining, and Lisa kept saying to me, imagine you're in your old role in Rhode Island, what kinds of things would you be thinking about? And one of the things, and I'm curious to know if this is true for you, everyone was writing about assessment in the summer and the early fall. And most of the things that were being written were about all the reasons why we should not do state testing this year and how difficult it was going to be. And a lot of people talked about the quality of the information. You know, how can we be sure that we're not putting a lot of energy, effort, and resources into something that will give us flawed data? So that was like one camp. And then there's a very real emotional part of this, like families saying, oh, it's been such a hard year for my son or daughter, and then they're going to finally get to school and you're going to test them. And that's going to be really, really hard. How can you do that right now? And then other places were saying, well, schools might be opening up, but we're fully remote. And I'm not sure about technology. I'm not sure about test security. I'm not sure about all those administrative conditions that we need in order to deliver a test remotely. And there you are on your state boards trying to kind of navigate and balance all of those pieces to make thoughtful decisions. And so I think there is a path forward. And I think I will just underscore what everyone has said and saying we don't do well with anecdotes. Anecdotes are incredibly interesting. They give color commentary to our data, but we really do need a starting point because we don't know where we are as a country. We have ideas about where our starting points might be, but I know that even when I look at my current school's interim assessment data, I'm surprised. I'm surprised that some of our kids are we have a you choose model at our school. So about 70% of our kids have been fully in person. About 20% are hybrid and 10% are fully virtual. And I'm really amazed at the profile of student who does well under different conditions. And I think that we all have ideas that if you're virtual, it's going to be bad. And if you're in person, it's going to be better. And that's not necessarily true because some kids are in person with great anxiety. Other people are home with lots of support. So we just don't know that. So we need to understand how our students are doing academically. And it's also an opportunity to understand the conditions under which different students thrived in different courses and at different age levels. So, you know, the very young ones from the high school kids. So the bottom line was when we put our toolkit together, we said that every effort should be made to test as many kids as possible, but you as states need to figure out where you're going to put your greatest effort and energy. And by that, I mean, you need to start thinking about where are you going to get data that you can stand behind and you say that it's valid and reliable and that you know that it is absolutely going to give us irrefutable data in as much as any state assessment data set can do that. And so for some, and I heard Abby say that one state is considering a sampling plan, you know, so for some, getting a really thoughtful, representative sample of kids at a district level might be great while offering to test everybody in the district, but you want data that at a district level, that district needs to know where kids are to make decisions. Others are doing that sampling at a school level. Some can say, I can't even get to a district or a school. I need a good state level sample so I know where Connecticut is after a year and a half of COVID. So we think the first part is deciding how well can you test any number of kids? Is it at the state level, the district, the school, or the individual level? And you need and maybe you can't do that in every content area in every grade. So when you start thinking about flexibilities and waivers, you say, you know what, I need my third grade reading data to be absolutely rock solid, because I know if kids, are at the end of third grade, are not reading well, I need to know where my state is on that. But you know what? Literacy in whatever grade you test in high school or grade 7, it'd be nice to have, but it's not essential. And I'm not going to put all my energy and effort into making sure that that data is as pure or clean or valid, however you want to frame it, as my third grade reading. And maybe you say, I need third grade reading and math. I need certain grade levels that are absolutely terrific. Others I'm going to be a little bit more lax on. But all of it goes back to having those conversations about how are you going to use the data? Why do you need it? And why is that data important? So that way you can come up with a clear communication plan to build the political will, the public will, to want to test. So I think in addition to that kind of technical, where are we going to put our energy? The next part is being really clear with everyone about how you're going to use that data and taking a moment to separate accountability from state assessment. And it's been my observation over the past 20 years, because I started, with No Child Left Behind, was when I was first an assessment director, that the two got conflated a lot. So when parents hear state testing, they think about what can be perceived as some of the punitive actions that occur under accountability. Kids are retained, kids can't graduate. That poor teacher who I love was not, given a bad teacher evaluation, or a school is labeled. How can you possibly label a school under COVID? Everybody is struggling. So teasing apart, this is an opportunity that we can build on in future years to once and for all separate the two. Yes, they work together and they have a relationship, but this year saying, no, state assessment is not being used irresponsibly or in a way that doesn't expect perfection when everyone has been doing as best they can under these conditions. And we know that. And that is kind of your leading use case scenario. And then that leads into your communication toolkit as well. So that people are really, really clear about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're going to use that information to benefit their child. And without that, we're on a fool's errand, I think. The other kind of like a beginning point before we get into questions that I would highlight is that you really think about, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my slides. I want to make sure where you have flexibility and making sure that you're giving flexibility for reasons that are worthy of flexibility. So it's not just COVID has been hard, so we're not going to test. It is flexibility for things that are real on behalf of kids. So if you have connectivity issues, if you have kids who are learning from home, and you're giving waivers to them, I think there's an obligation as parents. I know as a mom, I would want information about my child. So I think waivers should be done really sparingly, and that we should really kind of tap into, and I'm sure you're doing this in your states, talking with families about what do they want to know about their children's progress. because the parents that I've been talking to within my school and just kind of in my daily life, parents are really fearful about what's been lost for their children. And so I think the more that you all, and you're in the perfect spots to set up those conversations, to know what are parents' questions about their children. And if you can't get a state test into their hands, are there other ways that you can begin now to get information in other ways? So maybe you use interim assessments, not as your being really clear, they don't deliver all that a high quality state assessment connected to standards can do, but it might provide you some information. And I think you want to be really careful that you're not setting up conditions that may make it more difficult to move back into accountability and assessment for equity-driven policy considerations moving forward. So we have to be really, really careful about that this year, I think.